The pre-dawn darkness of May 1st, 1898, hung heavy over Manila Bay like a funeral shroud, broken only by the occasional glimmer of starlight on the restless waters. Commodore George Dewey stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Olympia, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he peered through the gloom toward the distant lights of Manila. Behind him, stretching in a disciplined line through the darkness, rode the most formidable naval force the United States had ever assembled in Pacific Water, 6 warships that would, in a few short hours, reshape the balance of power across an entire ocean. The tension aboard the American squadron was palpable. Sailors moved with quiet efficiency across rain-slicked decks, their faces etched with the peculiar mixture of anticipation and dread that precedes battle. Below decks, the thunderous heartbeat of steam engines echoed through steel corridors. As black gangs shoveled coal into roaring furnaces, their sweat-soaked bodies silhouetted against hellish orange flames, the acrid smell of coal smoke mingled with the salt air, creating an atmosphere thick with industrial might and maritime tradition. For Dewey, this moment represented the culmination of months of careful preparation and strategic maneuvering. The outbreak of the Spanish-American War had caught many by surprise, but not the methodical Commodore who had spent years studying the Spanish defenses of the Philippines. Intelligence reports had painted a picture of a colonial navy in debt, vessels, inadequate ammunition, and crews demoralized by years of imperial neglect. Yet Dewey knew that desperate men fighting for their homeland could prove more dangerous than any technological advantage might suggest. The Spanish fleet, commanded by Admiral Patricio Montoya y Pasaron, lay anchored in the shallow waters off Cavite, their dark hulls barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. The Reina Cristina, Montoya's flagship, sat among her sister ships like a queen surrounded by aging courtiers, proud vessels that had once represented the might of Spain's global empire, now reduced to the last line of defense for a crumbling colonial outpost. The admiral had chosen his position carefully, hoping that the shallow waters would prevent the Potion Americans from maneuvering effectively while allowing his own ships to retreat toward shore batteries if the battle turned against them. As the first pale fingers of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, Dewey's fleet maintained its steady advance toward the Spanish positions. The USS Olympia led the way, her white-painted hull gleaming like a ghost ship in the growing light, followed by the Baltimore, Raleigh, Petrel, Concord, and Boston. Each vessel represented the cutting edge of American naval technology, equipped with modern rifled guns, improved armor plating, and crews trained in the latest gunnery techniques that would soon prove their devastating effectiveness. The Commodore's orders had been simple, yet profound in their implications: destroy the Spanish fleet and establish American naval supremacy in the Far East. What seemed like a straightforward military objective would, in reality, mark the beginning of America's transformation from a continental power into a global empire. The young sailors manning their guns that morning could hardly comprehend that they were about to participate in one of the most decisive naval engagements in modern history, an action that would echo through the corridors of power from Washington to Madrid to the courts of Europe. At exactly 5:13 on that fateful morning, Commodore Dewey turned to his flag captain and uttered the words that would become legendary in American naval history: "You may fire when you are ready." The command rippled through the USS Olympia like an electric current, and within moments, the morning calm was shattered by the thunderous roar of at-tinch guns that sent the first American shells screaming across Manila Bay toward the Spanish fleet. The opening salvo marked the beginning of what military historians would later describe as one of the most one-sided naval engagements of the 19th century. The Olympia's guns, followed immediately by the concentrated fire of the entire American squadron, rained destruction upon the Spanish vessels with a precision and ferocity that quickly overwhelmed their antiquated defenses. Orange flames and black smoke erupted from the Spanish line as American shells found their marks with devastating accuracy,
Ow.
turning the peaceful morning waters into a hellscape of burning steel and human agony. Admiral Montoya, realizing immediately that his fleet faced annihilation, made a desperate attempt to close the distance with the American ships. Reina Cristina, her engines straining against battle damage, surged forward through the smoke and flames in a gallant but futile charge. that epitomized Spanish honor even in the face of inevitable defeat. Her guns blazed defiance as she approached the American line, but the volume of return fire was overwhelming. Shells crashed through her superstructure, tore gaping holes in her hull, and transformed her proud decks into scenes of carnage that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The technological disparity between the two fleets became apparent with each passing minute of the engagement. While the Spanish ships fired outdated projectiles that often failed to penetrate American armor, Dewey's modern guns sent shell after shell crashing through Spanish hulls with devastating effect. The USS Baltimore and Boston concentrated their fire on the larger Spanish vessels, while the smaller American ships systematically destroyed the enemy's lighter craft and shore installations with a methodical efficiency that spoke to months of intensive training and preparation. As detailed in contemporary accounts from Harper's Weekly, the battle unfolded with a swiftness that surprised even Dewey's most optimistic projections. Spanish return fire proved largely ineffective, with most enemy shells falling harmlessly into the water or bouncing off American armor plating without causing significant damage. The few hits that did find their marks resulted in minor casualties and superficial damage that barely slowed the American advance, while the Spanish fleet suffered catastrophic losses that mounted with each passing minute of the engagement. By just 7 o'clock that morning, the Spanish fleet had been reduced to burning wrecks scattered across the shallow waters off Cavite. The Reina Cristina lay listing heavily to starboard, her proud flag still flying despite the flames that consumed her superstructure. The Don Juan de Austria had exploded in a spectacular fireball that sent debris raining down across the battlefield, while smaller Spanish vessels had been literally shot to pieces by the concentrated American bombardment. The shore batteries that Montoyo had hoped would provide supporting fire had been systematically silenced by accurate American gunnery that left the Spanish defenses in ruins. The speed and completeness of the American victory stunned observers on both sides of the conflict. What military planners had expected to be a prolonged and bloody engagement had instead become a devastating demonstration of American naval superiority that lasted less than 7 hours from start to finish. Spanish casualties mounted into the hundreds, while American losses remained remarkably light, a testament to both superior technology and tactical execution that would reshape naval warfare doctrine for decades to come. The acrid smoke of battle had barely begun to clear when the full scope of American victory became apparent to all who witnessed the carnage floating in Manila Bay, where a proud Spanish fleet had anchored just hours before. Only burning hulks and debris-strewn waters remained as testament to the devastating effectiveness of modern American naval gunnery. The USS Olympia and her sister ships continued their slow patrol through the battlefield, their crews standing at quarters while Commodore/Wild Commodore Dewey assessed the completeness of his triumph and the strategic implications of what had just transpired. Spanish casualties told the grim story of technological disparity and tactical superiority combined with devastating effect. Admiral Montoyo's flagship, the Reina Cristina, had suffered over 150 killed and wounded, while the Don Antonio Wa de Ulloa had been completely destroyed with the loss of nearly her entire crew. Across the Spanish fleet, the toll reached into the 100 sailors, Marines, and officers who had served their empire faithfully, only to find themselves overwhelmed by forces they could neither match nor effectively resist in the face of. Superior American firepower and training, in stark contrast. American casualties remained almost miraculously light, considering the scale of the engagement. The USS Olympia reported only 7 men wounded, none seriously, while the entire American squadron suffered fewer than 20 casualties total. This extraordinary disparity would become a defining characteristic of the battle's historical significance, demonstrating not merely American victory, but the emergence of the United States as a modern naval power capable of projecting force across vast Pacific distances with devastating effectiveness. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Dewey faced with strategic decisions that would influence American foreign policy for generations to come. Control of Manila Bay meant effective control of the Philippine Islands, but the Commodore lacked sufficient forces to occupy and hold such a vast territory against potential Spanish reinforcement or native resistance. His victory had been complete within its scope, but it had also created obligations and opportunities that the American government would need to address with careful consideration of long-term imperial commitments and responsibilities. News of the victory would take weeks to reach the United States through submarine cable networks. But when it arrived, the American public would greet it with enthusiasm that bordered on hysteria. Dewey became an instant national hero, his name synonymous with American naval prowess and the nation's emergence as a global power. Newspapers across the country would trumpet the victory with headlines that captured both the scope of American triumph and the broader implications for the nation's role in world affairs moving forward into the 20th century. The Spanish government in Madrid received news of the disaster with shock and dismay that reflected not only the immediate military consequences, but also the broader implications for Spain's remaining colonial empire. The loss of the Philippines fleet meant that Spanish control of the islands had become untenable, while the demonstrated effectiveness of American naval forces suggested that other Spanish possessions might prove equally vulnerable to attack by modern warships equipped with superior technology and manned by well-trained crews. International reaction to the battle varied according to national interests and imperial rivalries. But most European observers recognized that a new player had entered the global balance of power with dramatic suddenness. British naval experts studied reports of the engagement with particular interest, noting both American tactical innovations and the implications of increased United States presence in Far Eastern waters, where British commercial and strategic interests had long predominated. Without serious challenge from other Western powers, the reverberations of Dewey's stunning victory at Manila Bay rippled outward from the Philippines like seismic waves, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape of the Pacific Ocean and announcing America's arrival as a formidable naval power on the world stage. European chancelleries from London to St. Petersburg found themselves forced to recalculate their assessments of American capabilities and intentions, while colonial administrators throughout the Far East watched with growing unease as reports of Spanish defeat reached their remote outposts via telegraph lines that carried news with unprecedented speed across continents and oceans. In Washington, President William McKinley and his cabinet grappled with the unexpected completeness of Dewey's triumph and the complex political questions it raised about America's future role in global affairs.
At the Commodore's overwhelming victory
Had created what military strategists would later term a strategic vacuum. In the Western Pacific, Spanish authority had been decisively shattered, but American forces lacked the immediate capacity to establish effective control over the sprawling Philippine archipelago with its millions of inhabitants and thousands of islands, scattered across hundreds of miles of tropical waters. The German government, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, viewed American success with particular concern given Germany's own imperial ambitions in the Pacific region. German naval forces had been quietly expanding their presence in Far Eastern waters, and the sudden emergence of American naval supremacy threatened to complicate German plans for establishing coaling stations and commercial bases throughout the region. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, architect of German naval expansion, ordered increased surveillance of American fleet movements while recommending cautious diplomatic approaches to determine American intentions regarding future territorial acquisitions. British reaction proved more nuanced, reflecting the complex relationship between the world's dominant naval power and the emerging American fleet that had just demonstrated its formidable capabilities. While some British naval officers expressed concern about potential competition in Far Eastern waters, others recognized that American naval strength might serve British interests by countering German and Russian expansion in regions where British commercial interests remained paramount. Despite growing international competition for influence and territory, as reported in contemporary dispatches from the Times of London, European military experts began intensive studies of American naval tactics and gunnery techniques that had produced such devastating results against Spanish forces. The battle had demonstrated the effectiveness of concentrated firepower delivered by modern rifled guns against older naval technologies. Lessons that would influence warship design and naval doctrine throughout the industrial world for decades to come. Japanese observers followed developments with particular interest, recognizing that American naval presence in the Philippines would significantly alter the strategic balance in East Asian waters, where Japan harbored its own imperial ambitions. The Japanese government, while maintaining official neutrality, quietly began reassessing its own naval capabilities and strategic priorities in light of demonstrated American willingness to project force across vast Pacific distances with remarkable effectiveness and minimal casualties. The economic implications of American victory extended far beyond immediate military considerations. Control of Manila Bay provided the United States with a potential gateway to the vast Chinese market, long coveted by American merchants and industrialists seeking new outlets for manufactured goods and raw materials. The Philippines offered not only strategic naval bases but also access to tropical products and trade routes that could significantly enhance American commercial influence throughout the Far East region. French colonial administrators in Indochina watched American developments with growing concern, recognizing that increased United States presence in the Philippines might encourage native independence movements throughout Southeast Asia. The demonstrated vulnerability of European colonial forces to modern American naval power suggested that other colonial territories might prove equally susceptible to outside intervention or internal rebellion supported by external powers, seeking to expand their own influence at European expense. The months following Dewey's decisive victory witnessed a fundamental transformation in American strategic thinking as policymakers in Washington grappled with the unprecedented opportunity to establish a permanent foothold in the Far East. The Commodore's continued presence in Manila Bay created what contemporary observers described as a fait accompli that effectively forced the McKinley administration to decide whether the United States would embrace its new role as a Pacific power or retreat from the imperial responsibilities that victory had thrust upon the nation. Congressional debates over Philippine annexation revealed deep divisions within American society about the nation's proper role in global affairs. Anti-imperialist speakers, led by figures such as Carl Schurz and Andrew Carnegie, argued passionately that American democratic principles were incompatible with colonial rule over foreign populations, while expansionists countered that strategic necessity and economic opportunity demanded permanent American control over territories won through military victory and paid for with American blood. The Spanish government, meanwhile, found itself in an impossible position, as military disasters in both the Pacific and Caribbean made continued prosecution of the war increasingly untenable. News of Manila Bay's loss, combined with similar naval defeats in Cuban waters, convinced Spanish leaders that negotiated settlement offered the only hope of salvaging some remnant of their once mighty colonial empire. Preliminary peace negotiations began even as Spanish officials desperately sought European support for mediated settlement that might preserve some vestige of Spanish dignity and territorial integrity. Dewey himself remained focused on the immediate tactical situation, working to maintain his squadron's combat readiness while awaiting reinforcements and clear strategic direction from Washington. The Commodore understood that his naval victory, however complete, represented only the first phase of what would inevitably become a much larger and more complex imperial undertaking, requiring substantial American ground forces and long-term political commitment to effective colonial administration. According to detailed accounts preserved in the Naval War College archives, Dewey's correspondence during this period revealed his growing awareness that military success had created political obligations extending far beyond his original orders to destroy Spanish naval forces. The Commodore found himself functioning as both military commander and de facto American representative to Filipino leaders who sought assurances about American intentions regarding their homeland's future political status and independence aspirations. Native Filipino reactions to American victory proved complex and ultimately tragic, reflecting centuries of Spanish colonial rule that had created deep divisions within Philippine society. While some Filipino leaders initially welcomed American forces as liberators who might support independence aspirations, others recognized that one colonial master had likely been replaced by another with potentially different but equally imperial intentions regarding Philippine sovereignty and self-determination. The economic dimensions of American control became increasingly apparent as business interests in the United States began lobbying for favorable trade policies and investment. Opportunities in the newly acquired territory. Sugar planters, mining companies, and textile manufacturers saw vast potential for profitable operations under American protection, while shipping companies anticipated lucrative contracts for transportation services between the Philippines and American mainland ports. International law experts debated the legal implications of territorial acquisition through military conquest, particularly regarding the rights of native populations and the obligations of conquering powers. Under existing international conventions, these discussions would prove prescient as the United States found itself confronting the same imperial challenges that had long plagued European colonial powers in dealing with subject populations seeking independence and self-determination. The strategic implications of permanent American presence in the Far East extended beyond immediate Philippine concerns to encompass broader questions about American naval policy and global commitments. Military planners recognized that effective control of the Philippines would require substantial ongoing investment in naval bases, coastal fortifications, and garrison forces capable of deterring potential challengers, while maintaining internal security across a vast and culturally diverse territorial expanse. As 1898 drew toward its close, the full weight of imperial responsibility began to settle upon American shoulders. It's like an unfamiliar and increasingly heavy burden. What had begun as a swift naval victory had evolved into a complex colonial undertaking that would test American resolve, resources, and democratic principles for decades to come. The ease with which Dewey had destroyed Spanish naval power in Manila Bay stood in stark contrast to the growing difficulties of establishing effective American control over a vast archipelago populated by millions of people with their own cultural traditions, political aspirations, and deep-seated resistance to foreign domination. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, formally transferred Spanish sovereignty over the Philippines to the United States in exchange for $20 million, a sum that critics argued represented payment for human beings rather than compensation for legitimate territorial claims. The treaty's ratification by the United States Senate sparked fierce debate that revealed fundamental contradictions between American democratic ideals and the realities of colonial governance that would haunt the nation's imperial experiment from its very inception. Filipino resistance to American control began almost immediately after Spanish withdrawal. Led by Emilio Aguinaldo and other independence leaders who had initially hoped that American victory might lead to Philippine freedom rather than merely a change of colonial masters. The Philippine-American War, as it came to be known, would ultimately cost more American lives and resources than the entire Spanish-American War, demonstrating that military victory was often the easiest part of imperial expansion while effective. Colonial administration proved far more challenging and expensive than initial proponents had anticipated. Dewey's role evolved from naval hero to colonial administrator as he worked to maintain stability in Manila Bay, while American ground forces attempted to establish control over the broader Philippine territory. The Commodore's correspondence, during this period as preserved in National Archives collections, reveals his growing frustration with the gap between military capability and political reality. His ships could dominate Philippine waters, but naval power alone proved insufficient to create the stable colonial government that Washington demanded. The economic costs of Philippine administration quickly exceeded initial projections as American officials discovered that colonial governance required substantial ongoing investment in infrastructure, education, health services, and military forces. What expansionists had promised would be a profitable imperial venture instead became a significant drain on American treasury resources while providing limited immediate economic benefits to offset the substantial costs of maintaining effective control over a large and potentially hostile colonial population. International observers noted with interest how quickly American imperial enthusiasm began to wane as the true costs of colonial administration became apparent. European colonial powers, long experienced with the challenges of governing distant Territories populated by resistant native populations watched with a mixture of amusement and sympathy as the United States learned painful lessons about the difference between military conquest and effective imperial governance that required sustained political will and financial commitment. The human cost of American imperialism extended far beyond immediate military casualties to encompass broader questions about the moral implications of imposing foreign rule upon populations seeking independence and self-determination. Forces found themselves employing tactics against Filipino insurgents that contradicted democratic principles and humanitarian values that the nation had traditionally championed in its international relations and domestic political discourse. Military historians would later identify the Philippine-American War as a crucial transition point in American military doctrine, marking the shift from conventional warfare between organized armies to counterinsurgency operations against guerrilla forces operating with popular support among civilian populations. These experiences would prove prescient for later American military interventions in distant territories, where conventional military superiority proved insufficient to achieve lasting political objectives. The legacy of Manila Bay thus extended far beyond Dewey's spectacular naval victory to encompass fundamental questions about American identity and values in an increasingly interconnected world where great power status seemed to require imperial commitments that conflicted with traditional American principles of democratic governance and anti-colonial sentiment that had shaped the nation's founding mythology. The echoes of cannon fire at Manila Bay had barely faded when historians and political observers began recognizing that Dewey's swift victory had marked a pivotal moment in world history, the emergence of the United States as a global imperial power capable of projecting military force across vast oceanic distances with devastating effectiveness. The battle that had lasted less than 7 hours on a tropical morning in 1898 would resonate through the 20th century and beyond, establishing precedents and patterns that would define American foreign policy for generations. Of leaders who would inherit both the opportunities and obligations that imperial power inevitably entailed, the immediate transformation of American naval strategy became apparent within months of the victory as Congress authorized unprecedented expansion of the United States Navy, including construction of advanced battleships and cruisers designed specifically for Pacific operations. Naval bases were established throughout the region, from Pearl Harbor to Subic Bay, creating a network of coaling stations and repair facilities that would enable American naval forces to maintain permanent presence in Far Eastern waters previously dominated by European colonial powers. Dewey himself became the embodiment of American naval prowess, his reputation transcending military circles to achieve popular celebrity status that reflected the nation's growing pride in its newfound global reach and influence. The Commodore's promotion to Admiral of the Navy, a rank created specifically to honor his achievements, symbolized both personal recognition and institutional acknowledgement that the United States had joined the ranks of world naval powers. With capabilities that demanded respect from potential rivals and allies alike, the strategic implications of permanent American presence in the Philippines extended far beyond immediate military considerations to encompass broader questions about the balance of power in East Asian international relations. Japanese leaders, in particular, recognized that American control of the Philippines represented a potential threat to Japanese expansion plans, while also offering opportunities for diplomatic cooperation in maintaining stability throughout the region where both nations shared interests in preventing European powers from dominating commercial and strategic relationships. Educational institutions across America began incorporating lessons from Manila Bay into their curricula as the battle became a symbol of American technological superiority and strategic vision that inspired a generation of young Americans to pursue naval careers and engineering studies. The United States Naval Academy at Annapolis experienced unprecedented increases in applications as parents sought to prepare their sons for service in what appeared to be an era of American naval supremacy and global influence. Economic historians would later identify the period following Manila Bay as a crucial turning point in American commercial expansion into Asian markets that had previously been dominated by European trading companies and colonial administrations. American businesses, protected by naval power and supported by diplomatic pressure, began establishing commercial relationships throughout the Far East. That would provide foundations for 20th century economic growth and technological innovation. The cultural impact of American victory resonated through literature, journalism, and popular entertainment as writers and artists celebrated what they perceived as validation of American democratic values and technological progress. However, these celebratory themes would eventually give way to more complex and critical assessments as the costs and contradictions of imperial governance became increasingly apparent to American observers and policymakers. The international legal precedents established by American actions in the Philippines influenced subsequent developments in colonial law and international relations, particularly regarding the rights of native populations under foreign rule and the obligations of imperial powers to provide effective governance and economic development. These precedents would prove significant during the decolonization movements of the mid-20th century, when former colonies sought independence from European and American control. Ultimately, the Battle of Manila Bay represented far more than a military victory. It marked America's irreversible transformation from a continental republic into a global empire with responsibilities and commitments that would shape the nation's destiny. Throughout the turbulent century that followed, Dewey's triumph had opened doors that could never be closed again, launching the United States upon an imperial trajectory that would bring both unprecedented power and unforeseen challenges that continued to influence American foreign policy and international relations into the 21st century and beyond.